à peu près ainsi. Donc, je suis Thierry Schuller, j'ai le plaisir de présider ce comité. Donc, on est là pour la soutenance d'Augustin. Now I will switch to English, and I first would like to introduce you the other members of the committee. We have on my right Heinz Pitsch from professor at Aachen University, and then followed by Daniel Scudier from CNRS Setil in Lyon, directeur de recherche, and then Triste? Ah. And directrice. Directrice, but in English it's okay. Directrice. And then we have Christophe Laroche from CNES. De Laroche. How bad I am. And then we have Jean-Louis Consalvi. I am a professor at Marseille, IUST Marseille. Et évidemment l'encadrant Guillaume Legros, maître de conférence ici à l'Université Paris-Sorbonne. À ma gauche, on a d'autres membres de l'UPMC, donc Stéphane Zaleski, professeur à l'UPMC, et enfin José Torero, professeur à l'Université College London. Bon, so now, Augustin, you have about 45 minutes to show us a summary of your work, and then we will go to the question session.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. President of the jury. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending my PhD defense. Vers le bas. I will present part of the work done over the last 3 years on the topic flame spread in microgravity environment, influence of ambient flow conditions. Today's problematic can be introduced with a very down-to-earth situation you all know, a barbecue. Because to grill some meat or cook a few vegetables, you need the heat generated by maybe smoldering coal. And in this combustion process, coal produces large amount of pollutants. For instance, an average grill can create enough carbon monoxide to suffocate a human being within a few minutes. Now, fortunately, none of you here has had such a terrible experience this summer, and that's because before these pollutants reach your nostrils, they've been diluted large amounts of time by the virtually unlimited amount of air that surrounds you in the atmosphere. Now, of course, this can be more problematic if you are in an enclosed environment. And pollutants can reach concentration above toxicity levels. This is why, of course, you cannot barbecue in an aircraft, but also why smokes and fumes are considered a major threat by aircraft carriers. For instance, this year alone, British Airways had to divert or emergency land up to 24 flights due to smoke in the cabin or in the cockpit. High-tech facilities are not spared, as reminded this year by the tragic incident about a Russian submarine that killed 14 sailors. As such, you would understand that the people in charge of the space industry are quite concerned with respect to this danger, because as Alexander Lazutkin puts it, in case of a fire, you cannot just open a window to ventilate the room. This wise comment comes from him because he knows what he's talking about. He was in the Mir space station in 1997 when one of the most dramatic fire events in the space history occurred. An oxygen canister that you can see here in red spontaneously caught fire, and even though the astronauts had been carefully trained to face such a situation, they all reported an unusual smoking behavior. Lazutkin recalls that the ship was full of smoke, and fellow astronaut Jerry Nanger says that he could not even see his hands in front of his face. Now, such a thick cloud of smoke is characteristic of soot particles, which absorb the light in a broadband fashion. Soot particles can be found in fire and in most types of diffusion flame, where the fuel on one side of the heat mixes with the oxidizer at that location. Soot history can be briefly summarized as follows. Soot is formed as polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons nucleate to form incipient spherical particles. These spherical particles can then either grow or agglomerate to form complex aggregate as shown here. In most situations, like this burner here, these soot particles are oxidated as they mix with oxygen in the ambient air. Now in our situation, it seems that some of these soot particles could escape in the surrounding air and then absorb the light in a broadband. Soot particles are well documented at normal gravity. However, any hasty conclusion should not be should be prevented, since the behavior in the absence of buoyant forces can be quite different. If you take, for instance, a candle on Earth, you can see that most aspects and the fluid mechanics, chemistry, and heat transfer are really affected by the presence of gravity. The hot air generated by the flame rises in the ambient colder and less dense air and forms thus convective patterns. Now, if you remove these convective patterns, then you immediately affect fluid mechanics. And if the fluid mechanics are modified, chemical distribution change, and so the chemistry is also affected. With the different chemistry, you have different heat transfer in the flame, and as such, you can understand that each of these three aspects of combustion interfere one with the other, and eventually, a flame would have a very different aspect once in the absence of buoyancy. In such a condition, then, the astronauts report that you have an increase in the amount of smoke produced, and this is one of the problems that we aimed at tackling in this PhD. To understand how smoke is formed, we need also to get back to the soot history, because throughout its history, soot can radiate in this broadband manner. This is the reason why you can see the yellow bright aspect of a flame over this candle, but from a local perspective, this radiation corresponds to a heat sink. This means that local energy is radiated away, and hence local temperature drops, especially at the flame tip, where you can have the freezing of oxidation hence in the atmosphere. This full mechanism is usually known as radiative quenching. So the question is to improve on the present situation. In which situation can we avoid radiative quenching? To do so, let's start with a simple example that was heavily documented on the ground. Quenching is also is heavily studied for pollution, but also combustion efficiency concerns. And so this kind of co-flow ethylene flame gives us valuable information. For instance, here, if you have a set flow of oxidizer in the outer ring, and if you vary the fuel flow rate in the inner ring, you can of soot temperature in the flame. And if you look closely at what happens at the flame tip, you can see that the temperature drops until the flame transitions from a closed tip situation to an open tip situation. This transition is usually referred to as a smoke point. In this situation, we can then conclude that fuel flow rate is a control parameter smoke production. However, in the event of a fire, it's likely that you won't be able to tune the fuel flow rate of the flame. Now, a second, maybe more relevant example is the role of pressure. In this situation, we have the same ethylene flame. We do not have any co-flow air, but we set the fuel flow rate. And you see here that as you increase the pressure, you can transition from a closed tip situation to an open tip here, where smoke particles are released in the atmosphere. Again, pressure can be then referred to as a control parameter, and this time it can be adjusted in a spacecraft. However, any rapid conclusion, we should avoid rapid conclusion, since in the case of a fire, the complex coupling between the flame on one side and the fresh fuel on the other is pretty different from pure gaseous flame that we studied so far. As such, we conducted flaming experiments in the absence of buoyancy. What you're seeing here is a flame that's going to propagate downward over a nickel wire. So you have a nickel chrome metallic core, and on top of that, some London City polyethylene coating on which the flame is set. As the coating forms a melted here that will retract, and you can see here in the opposed flow configuration that the flame is set on top. We observe here the very same transition, and as such, pressure can be defined as a control parameter in the graph. So the question is, what are the other control parameters available? If we keep the very geometry here of the opposed flame spread over a metallical wire, the control parameters are of two nature. You can either change the material properties of your sample, you can change the atmospheric properties of the oxidizer flow. Now, from a pragmatic perspective, material properties with respect to space exploration are very likely to be dictated by other issues. For instance, radiation shielding, which is still not solved to this day, is likely to require the use of polyethylene, which is the very material that you see burning on the left. Yet, atmospheric conditions are very likely to be devoted to fire safety issues, because as long as the astronauts can breathe, you can actually change the composition, but also the pressure or the flow velocity. And these are the parameters of interest that we will dig into this afternoon. The parameters that we will particularly focus on are the pressure, the oxygen content in nitrogen, and the flow velocity. And today's presentation will go from the macroscopic description of the situation in which you have a smoke, smoke production and in which you do not have one. Then we will go deeper and investigate the soot history to understand which mechanism drove this transition from non-smoking to smoking flame. And eventually, since we now know the characteristics of soot properties in the flame, we will try to investigate how they affect the fuel through pyrolysis process. First things first, we want to identify smoking condition. As such, we need two types of equipment. First, an equipment that will allow us to access weightlessness condition, and in the second time, we need an experimental setup that allows us to control at will the flow conditions around our samples. Then we will be able to report smoking tendency by running numerous experiments. Accessing weightlessness on the ground from a scientific perspective is done through 4 different means: drop towers, parabolic aircraft, standing rockets, and space station. They each feature their pros and cons, especially in terms of duration, and with respect to that parameter, any experiment should be conducted in the space station, because it provides virtually unlimited amount of time for combustion processes. Any results that I will show you today are actually part of a much larger project, which is led by the Japanese Space Exploration Agency, that will send an experimental setup to the space station next year, studying the very same configuration that we will see today. However, the results I will show today are from parabolic aircraft experiments. Now, as the name stands, parabolic aircraft perform a parabola in the air. This allows the experimenters to obtain up to 22 seconds of weightlessness. However, it should be reported that throughout the ballistic trajectory that the aircraft performs, the unwanted acceleration from the inhale of the aircraft, but also the effect of the wind or vibration of the structure, generate a residual acceleration field. As such, this period is referred to as microgravity, and the pilots do their best to keep any acceleration level below 5% of what is naturally felt on the Earth's surface. Now, these parabola were repeated 31 times per day, and we could take part over the last 3 years in 7 flight campaign funded by either the French or the European space agencies. And this rhythm here is quite demanding from an experimental perspective. From a more personal point of view, it's it's more than enough to have a lot of fun. However, it demands the creation of a very well-designed experimental setup. As such, an experimental rig was designed and built at Institut Jean Le Rond d'Alembert since 2012. You can see here the core element, which is a combustion chamber. In this combustion chamber, a flow is set from bottom to top, and you want to be able to tune the pressure, oxygen content, and flow rate. The oxygen content between 0 and 21% and the flow rate between 0 and 300 millimeters per second is set by using gas cylinder of compressed air and nitrogen. Bless you. The pressure in the chamber is controlled through a pressure control valve that is at the exhaust of the combustion chamber. And while after gas flows through this exhaust line, they are ejected towards the side of the aircraft. Samples are placed at the center of the chamber, where a laminar flow is established over a 40 millimeter in diameter cylinder, which was verified by experimental and numerical simulations. Any experiment recorded using a 3-color camera that is acquiring frames at a 40 frames per second rate, and a backlight can be used on the other side of the flame. When the backlight is set off, as shown here, you can capture the spontaneous emission of the flame in the blue, green, and red channels. If you add an additional backlight, you can now see the absorption of the soot particles at the flame plume. Sorry. Now, if you set alternatively the backlight on and off, you can capture both information simultaneously. As such, we now have all the tools we need to run our experiments. So let me show you one result. You're going to see here on the left the non-backlighted images separated from the backlighted images at the center. And if you subtract the first 2 images, then you're only left with the absorption field through the flame. So if we play this movie, we ignite with a Cantal wire at the top, and as gravity falls down and reaches the microgravity level, you can see the flame is established and propagates until it hopefully reaches steady propagation within the 22 seconds allotted. As you can see here, soot particles absorbed in a broadband manner the backlight in the flame. However, there is no presence of a trail of smoke behind the flame, and as a result, this condition here as reported as non-smoky conditions. If we now change just a bit the pressure, well, brace yourself. But so you can see again the flame ignited and propagating along this wire. However, this time you can distinguish a clear trail of smoke that is formed at the back, which shows us that quenching phenomena occurred in this situation. As such, this new set of conditions is reported to as smoky. Now, if you just populate graph by repeating one experiment in each parabola, you can see here variation of the smoking tendency as a function of pressure and oxygen content at a set flow velocity. From such a graph, we can conclude that pressure and oxygen content both play a role in the transition from non-smoky flames to your left to smoky flames on the right. If we repeat this graph at different flow velocity, we can see here that in the 100 millimeters per second to 200 millimeters per second, flow velocity doesn't seem to play a major role in the position of this boundary. To get further insight, we just plotted the three boundaries on the same graph, and running a genetic algorithm, we were able to sort from this arbitrary equation the value of the exponents. Such exponents support again the assumption that pressure and oxygen content play a major role, but flow velocity has a marginal impact on the smoke tendency. Now, if this can have some technical application from a scientific perspective, it doesn't explain anything at all. We have no clue as which mechanism drives the transition from a non-smoking flame to a smoking flame as you increase the pressure at set oxygen content and flow velocity. And we do not know as well what happens if you only increase oxygen content. For instance, we do not know whether or not both mechanisms are driven, both phenomena are driven by the same mechanism. As such, the next natural step was to investigate what were these mechanisms driving quenching in each situation. Now, if you recall the first graph, the oxidation or quenching phenomenon are the last bit of the soot history. So to understand what happens at the flame tail, we need to investigate what happened before. And to investigate what happened before, we will first look at soot formation by studying the fuel power release rate, and thus understand how much polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are formed in a flame. If we want to look at the soot growth mechanism, we will have to dig a bit into the soot residence time, and the radiations can be captured by estimating the radiative losses in the flame. So to begin with, we want to estimate the fuel power release rate. As such, we need to define a flame spread rate, because we have a set geometry, and it means that if we are able to define the flame velocity, then we can just simply find the fuel rate in the flame. So the flame spread rate was defined as the velocity of the flame front in the non-backlighted image here. So if you just report the position of the flame front in time, you can see here the velocity. This choice was made and applied for any flame that reaches a steady state, of course. Now, if we report the velocity at the different values of oxygen content, that is on the top axis here, you can see here it's a very dense graph. So the idea here is that for a set value of flow velocity and pressure, you report the different values of spread rate at different oxygen content. And if you overlap all these data here and you just perform regression on each of them, you can then get a mean spread rate as a function of oxygen content. And you can see here that there seems to be a linear dependency, and almost linear dependency between fuel flow rate and oxygen content. As such, of a smoke transition, because if you have a higher spread rate, it means you have more soot from, so you have more radiative losses, may have quenching. However, the conclusion is quite unnatural, because if you increase oxygen, you will have better process. And as we need to investigate a bit more to understand the balance between these two phenomena. To understand this balance, we reported our data with previously established a very nice experiment over an ethylene co-flow burner again, so with air on the side and fuel in the inner ring. They varied the oxygen content on the side, and they analyzed by how much they had to increase the fuel flow rate to stay at the smoke point transition. And what they report here can be very useful to us because if we look at what's happening in our area of interest in terms of oxygen content, we can find a critical mass flow rate evolution with the oxygen content. Now, if we simply try to compare both values, we see that in our situation, the fuel flow rate is increased much more than in the smoke point experiment by Glassman, which means that as oxygen content is increased, we create more fuel that is necessary to stay at the smoke point transition, and hence we have the transition from a non-smoking to a smoking flame. Of course, this very gross conclusion should be taken very carefully. First, because you can see here that the standard deviation is very high, and then because the values taken here and the values we found are fairly close. However, this gives us a nice approach to get some insight about the mechanism with respect to oxygen content. So we run similar observation regarding the flow velocity and also the pressure. You can see here how spread rate evolves with flow velocity in a graph of a similar fashion. This time we can see that flow velocity has a marginal impact on the spread rate, which is quite consistent with the thermal regime assumption, given that we have a very thin fuel. And if you do the same thing with pressure, you can see again that pressure has a marginal impact on the fuel flow rate. However, observation that we reported earlier said that pressure has a huge role on the smoke point transition, whereas flow velocity has a marginal impact on this phenomenon. And as such, we need to dig a bit deeper to understand the different effects of flow velocity and pressure. To do so, we need now a more precise description of the soot inside the flame. And to do so, we need to be able to access more data than just this macroscopic observation. Yet the present equipment that we have, with a broadband backlight on one side of the flame and a 3-color camera on the other, was designed first to resemble that of the modulated absorption emission technique. This technique that is shown here requires a much more complex equipment, but allows you, through the use of two lasers illumination, to retrieve soot volume fraction and soot temperature in the flame, which are information that we want to access to. Information is captured with quite a similar camera, and as such, the question we want to ask ourselves is whether or not we can extend the first technique to the second setup, which means, can we extend the first technique to a broadband system? To answer that question, we need to get back to the fundamentals of the MAE technique, which I will recall now. The MAE technique uses the fact that uses the axisymmetry of a flame. So if you observe at a given height in the flame, you can discretize any properties along concentric rings. Rings, as long as the properties do not vary too fast in the flame. As such, you want then to solve the radiative transfer equation. So this radiative transfer equation shown here describes how much energy is carried by a light beam crossing a participating medium. The energy is increased by spontaneous emission, local spontaneous emission, decreased through absorption and scattering, and potentially increased by scattering from light beams with different orientations. However, this equation here is way too complicated to be solved from our experimental setup observation, and as such, under a strict list of hypotheses that I will not describe at the moment, but we can get back to them in the question, we can arrive to a much simpler expression of this equation that only considers the spontaneous emission and the absorption field in the flame. In this equation, the parameters of interest, the soot volume fraction and temperature, are embedded first in the soot absorption coefficient and in the spontaneous emission term, which can be modeled through a black body emission law. The procedure of the modulated absorption emission technique is not too difficult. The idea is just to integrate this equation along light beams. So to obtain parallel light beams here, we use different optical setups. In our case, we required the use of a telecentric lens that collects only light beam coming from infinity. As such, if you integrate this equation along the first light beam without any incident light source, you can see here that the energy you collect over a pixel of your camera is the sum of the spontaneous emission at each location, potentially absorbed through the rest of the flame. If you add an additional light source at the back, you can see now that the very same term from the flame spontaneous emission remains, and we have an additional term which corresponds to the emission of the backlight that has been absorbed through the flame. Now the parameters of interest are intimately entangled here, and as such we cannot solve these equations directly, But from a simple analysis that was conducted by the founders of this technique, if we can subtract these two equations and potentially divide by these unknown parameters at the front, we are left with the exponential decay through the flame. And as such, using discretization on these different rings, you can find, using an onion peeling method and potentially a Tikhonov regularization, the absorption field at each layer that you can relate to the soot volume fraction. Now, such a complex operation can be very easily done experimentally because the subtraction corresponds of the subtraction of an image of the spontaneous emission of the flame to an image of spontaneous emission of the flame with an additional backlight. And the prefactor that you see here is just the energy from the backlight in the absence of a flame. Once the soot volume fraction field is retrieved, you can inject it in the first equation, so the spontaneous emission of the flame. And by comparing the signal at two different wavelengths, again to get rid of the prefactor here, you can find now the temperature field in the flame. So you can access soot temperature as well. Now, before we apply this method to our spreading flame in microgravity, we need to validate it on the ground. Before even doing an experimental validation, we went through a numerical investigation of this. Sorry, I just skipped a slide. But of course, this method here cannot be straightforwardly extended to our broadband optics that you see here, because space and spectral integral cannot be permuted, since any properties are intimately linked to both, are both dependent from the wavelengths and their position in the flame. However, 5 observations support the fact that we can run a similar approach. First, we can still build this image ratio, so we can still have the transmission and emission field. Then we can access any properties through careful calibration of our optical setup. And last, the onion peeling method is still available. And as such, if you run a numerical method by trial and error, if you overestimate soot volume fraction at one location, you will underestimate the absorption field through the flame. So by comparing with experimental data, you can then adjust the soot volume fraction value. And then if you overestimate the temperature, you would overestimate the emission of the flame, and as such, recover a wrong color ratio. Now before implementing this method in the aircraft, we of course run numerical simulations to see whether or not we could have a proper algorithm. So by modeling the camera with its spectral transmission range, the flame by its soot volume fraction and temperature fields, and the LED by their spectral emission, we could work with very clean fields, shown here. The method is pretty simple. We run a convolution algorithm, so we integrate the radiative transfer equation through the flame. We generate the synthetic image which resemble what we would capture with a camera. And then we go through the deconvolution process to retrieve the soot volume fraction and temperature fields. By comparing the original and retrieved fields, we can then assess the quality of the method. This allowed us to first investigate the different hypotheses made, and which are described in the appendix of the manuscript. And then this also helped us improve on the methodology. Just to give you a quick overview, if you look at the temperature profile in the flame, your objective when you run deconvolution is to retrieve exactly the same thing as the original. So you want to find yourself on the x equal to y curve. The original method, in the presence of an additional noise on the synthetic image, provided us this kind of data. Now with the new method that we developed, we were able to better converge on the x equal y axis, which means that we can better predict the radiative losses from soot in the flame. Empirical investigation were carried out. We validated our setup by comparing it to the original spectral resolve over a Centaur that you can see here in the center. And these are the fields that we could obtain. Of course, the results from the new broadband modulated technique shown on the right here are of lesser quality than the original. Comparing with the spectrally resolved data, that the soot volume and temperature are recovered with proper topology and a sufficiently accurate precision on the value. And as such, the distribution in the field, in the soot volume fraction temperature field, suggests that we can still well predict the radiative properties of the flame we wish to study. As such, this methodology was performed over the average fields obtained in parabolic experiments. This allowed us to obtain this kind of soot volume fraction and temperature data, and we could, as we first guessed, observe that in this environment there is an increased amount of soot that is formed. So if we want to understand how the soot properties affect the quenching, we can do this by studying the soot residence time and radiative loss. Soot residence time cannot be accessed via images, but we can define a characteristic soot length. The characteristic soot length is defined as follows. You want to find the location at which polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are formed, and we suggested that this location could be collocated to the presence of the melted droplet. Because if you have here the fuel that transforms from the solid to a liquid state, you can clearly see over a nickel chrome wire that this droplet retracts, and we assume then that the fuel could be formed as soon as the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons could be formed as soon as the fuel reaches a liquid state. So we define the first position here, and the second position that is shown here corresponds to the maximum of the radially integrated soot volume fraction. This position here suggests that you have a balance between the soot formation and growth mechanism and the soot oxidation mechanism. Oxidation domains above this line, while formation and growth below. We can then define here lengths over which dominate. Now, if we report this length and compare it with our two parameters of interest, which are the flow velocity and pressure, you can see here that the soot length is marginally affected again by flow velocity. This means that if you have a constant length but varying velocity, you would have different residence time, since in microgravity, so the force flow dominates any flow, the transport mechanisms. This means here that soot residence time decreases as the flow velocity increases. As such, we have a parameter that tells us that we are likely to form less soot as the velocity is increased, and so we may have observed a transition from a smoking to a non-smoking flame as flow velocity is increased. However, we saw here that if we increase the flow velocity, we have a higher rate of soot volume fraction by estimating the maximum soot volume fraction in the flame. And this is quite counterintuitive, and yet if we see all the data here, we see that even though the standard deviation again is quite high, it still suggests that the formation rate increases with the flow velocity. Experimental data here cannot provide us a deeper insight of the mechanisms in the flame, so we went through some numerical simulation and investigated soot volume fraction. We investigated this configuration at one value of pressure on oxygen content and tried two flow velocity, 100 and 200 millimeters per second. We checked by comparing the numerical data with the experimental one that soot volume fraction and temperature topologies were consistent, and also that we had a proper value of the flame standoff distance. And numerical investigation allowed us to highlight that the soot formation rate was actually increased at higher flow velocity. And this is because if you have a smaller time, then you have less radiative losses. So the local temperature is higher, and hence the soot formation rate is increased. And in our situation, these two mechanisms, the second mechanism prevails, justifying why we can find a higher soot volume fraction. Looking now at the effect of pressure, we see again that pressure has a marginal impact on soot length. However, as here the experiments are all performed at a set flow velocity, this also means that the soot residence time is not affected by pressure. As such, it is quite valuable to understand the effect of pressure on the soot formation rate, since all the other parameters seem to be set. And if we report soot volume fraction as a function of pressure, one of the major findings of is that we can find a cubic dependency in our geometry of the maximum soot volume fraction as a function of pressure. If we bear in mind that we have this set fuel input and constant formation length, then it means that the soot formation rate follows a cubic power law. Now this increase in soot volume fraction may be responsible for the transition we saw from non-smoking to smoking flame, and as such we wish to investigate a bit more about the radiative quenching in the flame, the soot radiative properties in these flames. The best thing to do is to give you a small example. So what you see here are three flames that are established over this, so always the same sample. And you see here for a set value of flow velocity and oxygen content, three different pressures. So a low pressure flame here, intermediate value here, and a high pressure flame on your right. And we report at different locations in the flame, so from Z1 to Z4, the amount of soot volume fraction to your left and the amount of temperature to your right. Data at low pressure are reported in blue, intermediate pressure in orange, and high pressure in yellow. If we look at the height Z2, which corresponds to the first location where we have a significant amount of soot in the different flames, you can see here that high pressure flames correspond to the highest soot load. However, the temperature from the highest and intermediate pressure flame is quite similar. The two temperatures are quite similar. We do not report here the temperature from the low pressure flame since we have low amount of soot volume fraction, and as such we are out of the confidence range. Now, if we investigate what happens a bit higher in the flame, you still see here that there is a larger amount of soot at high pressure. However, this time the two temperatures start to diverge. The idea here is that a soot at a lower height in the flame with the same temperature means that you have increased radiative losses. And if you have increased radiative losses, then higher in the flame you will find a lower temperature. If we keep digging at what happens higher in the flame, you can see here that eventually at the intermediate pressure situation, the soot has been oxidized as compared to the Z3 height. But with respect to the highest pressure, you do not have any more soot oxidation. And this can be linked to the temperature you see to your right here, where it seems that the new temperature found in this high pressure flame corresponds to the freezing of the oxidative reaction. We can then, from this simple example, two questions arise. First, can we identify a critical value of the soot radiative losses? And can we also identify a critical temperature for oxidation? If we want to investigate the soot radiative losses in the flame and be able to plot the effect of pressure on the soot-related radiative losses, we need to be able to estimate them over the whole flame. As such, the fields that we have so far of soot volume fraction and temperature allow us to plot detailed mappings of the soot losses in the flame, soot relative losses in the flame through this very simple and calibrated model. By integrating over the whole flame the value of the soot-related radiative losses, we could produce for a set value of flow velocity and oxygen content the evolution of radiative losses with pressure. And you can see here that there seems to be a threshold at a value of about 5.5 watts. Now the value here, the absolute value here, is only relevant in this simple configuration, and as such we prefer to compare this value here with a typical one from the spread. Bearing in mind that a constant oxygen content means that you have a constant spread rate, we can compare this value with the heat release rate of our spreading flame. And we can find here that the soot in the flame corresponds to approximately 20% of the heat release rate at this transition. Now, such a conclusion correlates well with observation made at normal gravity, especially by the RIS, who observed that you could have 30% of radiative losses in the whole gas phase of the flame. In our situation, we only used soot in the flame, and as such, we forgot anything for instance, a carbon dioxide or water. A numerical simulation we conducted suggested that in our situations, 2/3 of the radiation are linked to soot, and as such, we can match this 30% estimation. However, it should be reported that this value here strongly disagrees with previous experiments made of a burner in the absence of buoyancy, which reported a radiant fraction at the smoke point transition between 0.4 and 0.6. Investigating then temperature, we can try to find a critical temperature for oxidation, freezing of the soot particles. Again, if we look at the integrated soot volume fraction in the field, so you recognize here the same peak about before, and if we look higher in the flame in the situation where smoke is produced, you can see here a plateau, which means that soot oxidation reaction seem to be frozen. As such, if we report the temperature at this location in the flame, and if we average this by the distribution of soot volume fraction, we find in the situation of smoking flames, so at high pressure, the temperature at this location. And it seems in one set of experiments that is shown here that you have this critical temperature of 1400 kelvins, which is again quite consistent with observation made at normal gravity with respect to soot mechanism, but differs again from the same set of observations in microgravity that reported temperatures as low as 1000 kelvins. Now, if we were able to have some information and all these insights about what happens with respect to the smoke production, having this detailed mapping of soot properties in the flame is also fairly valuable if you want to understand what happens at the sample surface. So just to recall what we've seen so far, we've seen that if you increase oxygen content, you increase the pyrolysis rate, and this seems to be linked to the quenching observation that we can find. If you increase the flow velocity, you have a steady pyrolysis rate, but you reduce the formation time. However, this mechanism is balanced by the soot formation rate that increases the maximum soot volume fraction in the flame. And if you vary the pressure, then you do not affect the pyrolysis rate, you do not affect the formation time, but the formation rate is drastically changed with the cubic power law. And as such, quenching can be observed at high pressure. And so what I was starting to talk about before I noticed that I added an extra slide, is that if you have all the properties of the soot in the flame, you can then the sample surface. This will impact the pyrolysis mechanism, which can be critical with respect to the different chemical production and especially soot production. Soot radiative feedback and soot radiative balance will then be our last topic of interest in today's presentation. As a matter of fact, since we could produce detailed mapping of radiative losses in the flame, it's actually fairly straightforward to obtain the radiative feedback at the sample surface. By conducting an optically seen assumption and just running some simple geometry over the samples, you can actually produce mapping such as this one of the heat feedback to the wire surface. This feedback here can come in very handy if you want to understand the local pyrolysis condition with to the amount of radiative feedback at each location of the fuel surface, and also if you want to understand the net radiative balances at the fuel surface. Integrating over the whole sample, we can see that in our simple geometry here, we have more or less, no matter what the pressure is, 6% of the total radiative losses in the flame that are fed back to the wire surface. But if we focus on the location of the fuel, which is to your left here, with the melted droplet you recognize here and the unburned surface of the fuel to your left, then only 3% of the radiative losses in the flame are fed back to the surface. Now, if this can seem a very small number, we should bear in mind that up to 30% of the heat release rate from the flame concerns radiative losses. And if we have this figure with soot-related radiative losses, it may likely concern other combustion products. This data can come in very handy for the development of semi-empirical theoretical models. You can see here a model that is developed and has been published this year by a Japanese team. And what they're doing here is trying to forecast the spread rate of the flame in the same configuration by defining the different heat transfer in the flame. Now, when it comes to radiative heat transfer, they didn't have enough information, and so they suggested that they could neglect radiative balance at the fuel surface. This is a very relevant hypothesis. However, what we see now is that from our measurements, we can find what is the net flux from the flux from the flame to the sample surface, and if we can access then the radiative losses from the sample to the ambient atmosphere, we can have access to this net flux. However, the heat flux from the sample to the surrounding atmosphere requires to find a fuel surface temperature. Now, the fuel surface temperature cannot be very easily accessed through material properties, since the pyrolysis of low-density polyethylene is fairly complex. This material pyrolyzes between 400 and 750 kelvins, and as such, we cannot forecast which of these two temperatures is more likely to resemble that of the sample surface. However, if we take these two extreme cases, if we assume that the temperature at the surface is 400 kelvins, we can compare the net radiative flux with the flux required to sustain propagation. And you can see here that in this condition, sorry, little spoiler, but in this condition you have a negligible amount of the net radiative flux can be neglected before this standard flux. However, if you report a surface temperature on 750 kelvins, then you will drastically overestimate the spread rate by using a net balance equal to 0, because you're going to miss something that is almost equal to a -1 factor. Now, if we just summarize what we've seen today, So first of all, one of the core elements of this PhD was the development and assessment of a new optical setup that extended the modulated absorption emission technique to a broadband system. Then its implementation in parabolic flight allowed us to repetitively carry out experiments and obtain this kind of mapping, which traduce the effect in the flame. We can then plot, by repeating the experiments, graphs that allow us, even though the quality of each line is not perfect, via data agglomeration, we can find the trends we can find the influence of the ambient flow conditions on soot properties. And last, we could then understand a bit better how quenching mechanism happens in this environment through the use of these mappings. Now, of course, anything that has been shown today has triggered more questions than it has answered. For instance, developing a new broadband optical setup requires perfect knowledge of the soot properties in the flame. In this novel microgravity environment, soot properties are still not very well understood, and as such, a new PhD starts now and will deal with the sampling technique that allows us to find soot morphology through TEM observation. The parabolic flight implementation, so we saw the limitation of parabolic aircraft, and we will then conduct next year experiments with the same configuration, but with much less gravitational acceleration in the space station. And as such, we can confirm or infirm the trains we've identified and maybe blurred by gravitational defects. If we have been able so far to identify some of the ambient flow conditions, the influence of some of the ambient flow conditions, we still have a lot of data to process. And in addition to running more experimental post-processing, we can also interact with numerical models to try to understand deeper the phenomena that are not accessible through experimental measurements. And last, if we've been able to investigate quenching, I kept saying that we see always the same configuration and the same material, and this is a huge limitation that we will try to overcome by investigating different fields and different geometries. Now, thank you for listening to this presentation. If I had to thank anyone who was responsible for the work that I had to do in this lab, well, I'd have to go for another 45 minutes. So I just want to thank especially Guillaume for his perfect management of the PhD. So I lost a few things on the way. I never lost his trust, so that's a very good thing. Thank you also, Jean-Louis, for your presence, no matter what time of the day and night. I want to thank everyone from the jury for coming today and listening to my French English. And of course, anyone in his room has contributed one way or another to the very good 3 years that I've had in Paris recently. So thank you for listening, and I'm now ready to take questions from the members of the jury.